All right. Senate institutions, we're back in action with John Gray, and we're going to finish the walkthrough of the Capitol bill. Take it away.
Perfect. So John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel. I will screen share where we left off yesterday, which was section 18 of the Capitol bill. So this is speech 494. And let me expand a little bit. Look at that green border. Okay, so what we have done at this point yesterday is we walked through the sets of appropriations with bonded dollars behind them for each of the projects, the line items. We talked about some of the additional flexibility and language that have been provided at House Corrections and Institutions suggestion and as passed by the House. So what we're getting to now in section 18 is the actual authorization of the bonding for those projects. So those line items are just saying we appropriate particular funds, but now the authorization. So what you see in subsection A is the CDAP recommendation, that 2-year recommendation for a dollar amount. So authorized to issue general obligation bonds in the amount of 100 million for the purposes of funding those appropriations that we walked through yesterday. And then standard language, determining the appropriate form of maturity, consistent with the underlying nature of the appropriation to be funded, and just generally, like as a reminder to what to think about with capital expenses and why they are backed by general obligation bonds as opposed to other kinds of money. We're talking, for capital expenses, we're typically thinking about 20+ year investment life of something. And so you're trying to align essentially investment terms with that 20+ year investment life. And so general obligation bonding is kind of seen as appropriate for these pieces. And we have some restrictions on what general obligation bonding can go to, and capital expenses are these things. So that's why the capital bill is backed by general obligation bonding. Lots of things are not backed by cheap fund. Subsection B, this is trying to account for all of the money to support the appropriation. So I talked yesterday about how, you might have $100 million in CDAP recommended authorization, but you could have additional funds beyond that, right? Because you could have reallocations from the prior year. So some additional bonding that wasn't issued is still out there, and you can use that this year. What this subsection B gets at, the 6.89 million, is that last year, when the Treasurer's Office went out for bonding, in one instance, at least one instance, they sold above par. So they generated a bond premium. And then rather than issuing all of the bonds they have been authorized to issue and retaining that bond premium as cash on hand, what they did is they offset the amount of bonding that they had to do. So they reduced the amount of bonding they went out for by the bond premium.
By the way, I see what you did there.
Yeah.
Above par.
Only were I so clever. I wish I could take credit for my jokes, but sometimes I just land on them. So in this case, all along throughout the process, on the House side, we had understood that premium was available in cash. That had been the understanding all along. And then on the final day, we received this notification that in fact it wasn't available in cash, but it reduced the bonding. And so that's what this language does, is it authorizes the additional issuance of the bonds that didn't go out last year because they were offset by that bond premium, which results in this figure here. So that's how you get all the backing that you'll see in your spreadsheet for the projects. In section 19, we're switching to cash. And you're going to see that this section is kind of distinctive because a lot of this is intent. It is authorizing particular projects to be backed by cash in the cash fund, but it doesn't outright make the appropriations because, and I was mentioning yesterday, there are these informal agreements within the State House as to where authority should come. In an attempt to be respectful of the Appropriations Committee, this section is dealt with differently. The appropriations are deemed to be things that belong to the appropriations bill and are appropriations jurisdiction. At least that's been understanding amongst the states. So what this section does is it expresses intent. It says, this is what the things the institution, these are the projects that the institutions committees want to be backed by cash. We're going to let you guys make the cash appropriations, but we're just going to give you a list of all the numbers. It's basically dictating what they are, but trying to be respectful about it. So Section 19, you'll see here subsection A, the General Assembly finds that in addition to the issuance of GO bonds, eligible capital projects may be funded from the cash fund. And it's the intent of the legislature to authorize certain capital projects in this act, but appropriate the funds in the FY26 Appropriations Act. So they've been built into, those have been built into the big bill. There's also the intent that that Appropriations Act would appropriate funds for projects in FY 2027. So you could come back and adjust those. Subsection C sets out the actual authorization. So this is going to look just like your line items that you saw above for your GO bonding, but this is going to be backed by cash. And all of these are FY26. I don't think we have any FY27 cash proposals. You may receive those next year.
And John, this section,
Mhm.
this subsection is the same as what's in the big bill.
Yes.
I think it's the same language.
Yes.
Is that an issue? Because technically two laws doing the same thing.
It creates this, it is weird, is the way I would describe it. And without the background understanding of the way the state house works, I felt uncomfortable with
Yeah.
it because the way I think about it is spending authority is spending authority. And an appropriation is spending authority. And this does authorize spending authority, but they've used this specific language of authorized, which is what I think we're hinging on here on line 6. Authorized, and we always use appropriate when we're actually making the funds available to those folks. So I think we're good. And I will say that this is what we've done in the past to deal with the cash fund language, but I agree with you that it is odd. And many things around the cash fund are odd and they may become less odd in future years because in part you're in the frontier days of the cash fund, right? This was created in 2022. So folks are still working out the way that this process works. And you will likely hear or may have already heard that the administration has wanted the cash fund to just be dealt with in the capital bill, and you just outright make the appropriations here, and that's that, and then the appropriations from that cash fund. But up to this point, the lines have been drawn such that I think folks are just trying to let the appropriations committee make the appropriations themselves. And so that's what you see here are line items for the cash back projects. I'm happy to stop on any of these, but in any case, you're going to want to hear from BGS or the relevant entity on what a particular project is. Let's see. Yes, so subsection, when we jump to page 25, you're going to see a new subsection D. And this is distinguishing between the different sub-accounts. So subsection C was talking about that classic capital infrastructure sub-account, the one where you think of as kind of like overflow for capital projects that would otherwise go through the capital bill. This subsection D is about the other sub-account, the sub-account B or sub-account 2B, however you think about it. The other infrastructure essential investments and reserves account. And this in FY 2026 authorizes spending authority from that sub-account to A&R for the DEC for the state match to the infrastructure IIJA Drinking Water State Revolving Fund and Clean Water State Revolving Fund. So 14.5 million. I know that the chair had particular interest in some of these provisions, and in any case, you would want to speak to the folks at these.
John, they're coming in tomorrow and we're
Okay.
gonna see where this is gonna buy. This is where I think I've always had conversations with you where we've had 8-to-1 match or 10-to-1 or 14-to-1. And this is what we're gonna hear, how much that 14.5 buys.
Are you good with us just interrupting?
Oh, yeah, totally. Yeah. Appreciate it. People don't normally ask them. It's nice. Subsection E, this is creating some additional flexibility, much like what we've seen in the geo bonding section. So Commissioner of BGS is authorized to transfer any unexpended project balances between that and C7. Let me scroll up just to pull that. So that's your Vermont Veterans Home Design and Construction of the A wing. We talked about the B and C wing pieces yesterday and how those weren't ready to go. So this permits transfer between the A wing and amounts appropriated for the emergency generator and boiler plant replacement. So rejiggering the way that some of that money flows for the vets home to account for their current needs. And that's the end of your money pieces of the bill. And you switch to the second half of the bill, which is your policy sections. So these can vary wildly between capital bills, right? Depending on whatever the policy concerns that come within a year. Whereas generally the sections you saw before, while they may have different figures, they're going to look awfully similar year to year. It's going to be line items for particular agencies backed by geo bonding. So your policy section. So first we're talking about in section 20, the capital budgeting process. So we're looking at Title 32, section 701A, and this is the section that sets out the actual capital construction bill, what governs the bill that we're talking about here. And what you see on page 26 is that the Commissioner of Finance and Management requires entities to which spending authority has been authorized in previous capital bills to submit a report on outdated or older funds on each project with unexpended funds. So it's basically checking in on your 2 or more year prior projects. That would include plans for the unexpended funds, any projects or contracts the funds are assigned to, and anticipated timeline for expending the funds. Currently, the way that works in our line 9 is that comes on or before December 15th of each year. Submitting that, the commissioner submits a consolidated format that pulls together all the reports they receive from each of the agencies with outstanding unexpended funds on these projects. They submit that to you guys so that you guys can check in on these older projects, right? This is just updating the date to align with when the GovRec for the budget comes in. So it's just present this package alongside the other information that we're providing. Section 21 is trying to get at the presentation of the information that you receive during this capital budgeting process, which is the form of the annual capital budget and the 10-year capital program plan. And it's going to look a little funny, but I'll be able to explain this. So what needs to be provided in that capital budget plan? In the past, what we heard on the House side is that when the information was provided, there would be charts that would show how money flowed over time for particular projects. And it might look back many, many years to say, in this year, we spent this much, in this year, we spent that much. And in recent years, folks were saying on the House side that they haven't received these same charts, and it just complicates the process for doing this capital budgeting. Basically, they have to do the work themselves to find out what funds have been spent in the years past. So they end up duplicating the charts for themselves. And what this language is, it's meant to be a request to say, can you please keep providing those charts? That's basically what this is. So the language you see is, as part of this budget, include amounts appropriated and expended for the current fiscal year and the preceding fiscal year. But also, this is the new language, for the 5 fiscal years preceding these, the assessment shall include the aggregate amounts appropriated and expended for individual projects, which amounts shall be categorized by funding type, so cash, bond, so you can know where that lands, and presented in a format that concisely displays the funding stream and project phases, so you know where the project you are. Again, this language is just saying, give us that same chart that you used to give us. Section 22 is some cleanup to the cash fund. This is a substantive update, in part to punt a little bit, I would say. The way that existing law works for the cash fund is we have this subsection E, and I'm just going to read this without the new language. Any entity authorized to make expenditures from the capital infrastructure subaccount, that's your subaccount A or 1, your primary overflow for capital projects, shall have not more than 2 years from the legislative session in which the act authorizing the expenditure was enacted to encumber the funds. Any remaining unencumbered shall remain part of the fund account. So basically this kind of a clawback. It was after 2 years this would happen. So you see 2 updates here. One is extending to 3 years. And this is what I was describing as the punt, because basically folks haven't figured out yet how we should deal with cash reallocations. Although I will say it still makes cash reallocation. So it does take a position on cash reallocation, but the extension to 3 years is a bit of a punt and just saying we haven't fully resolved this area. So let's extend it a little bit. We're in the early days of the cash fund. So let's just get a little bit more time. And the second piece, this on line 18, from the end of the legislative session, there was some confusion as to what time the clock started. And so this makes clear that the clock starts once the legislative session, once the veto session has closed out of the legislative session, basically. And only then do you have your 3 years kick in. So some cleanup type changes and extending the timeline to resolve the cash reallocation. On page 28, we have a substantive provision that is pulled from want to say this was pulled from a bill on the House side that was sponsored by Representative Wozniak related to flood remediation across the big bill. But this pulls out one property related provision. So transfer of the Randall Meadow property in the town of Waterbury. This authorizes BGS to survey, subdivide, and transfer the Randall Meadow, which is identified by parcel number. So we do have a specific reference to that piece, provided that it may be transferred only once that parcel has been subdivided to reflect stormwater management needs of the Waterbury State Office Complex to the satisfaction of the commissioner, that any permits have been obtained with the commissioner and the town of Waterbury and created a plan to align the transfer of the current lease for the parcel. So just a little bit of background here. As I understand it, this is basically a flooded land, and I think there's farmland here, and this is trying to say, let's make this usable. Right now, this isn't doing like floodable land, and so we're transferring with the idea that it's going to account for in subdivision 1 the stormwater management needs of the Waterbury State Office Complex. So there is a advantage to the state in doing this. And the reason I call this out is that the specific language here on line 5 is transfer. This does not require selling the land. We're talking about state property here, but it's not being sold. That's why you have this notwithstanding language. We have a statute that requires that you sell at fair market value, essentially, or that you go out to bid or the like. We're notwithstanding that section and saying this is just going to be transferred. And there's a bunch of testimony on the House side getting at this particular provision. This is where they landed that it would just be transferred, provided these conditions were met. Section 24, this is your capital complex flood recovery. This is providing some updates related to who gets notice of decisions and updates made by this special committee. So this is a committee that deals with flood recovery for the capital complex. And the language you see added at the top of page 29 is to require that in addition to quarterly updates to the special committee on the planning process, capital complex flood recovery, the flood recovery, they provide timely notification to the city of Montpelier and the Montpelier Commission for Recovery and Resilience of alterations to proposals and plans for flood recovery. So just extending the notice provision so that Montpelier Commission for Recovery and Resilience know what's going on within this capital complex flood recovery. And we heard from BGS, although admittedly it was the last day when we were talking about these provisions, that this would be doable. This was feasible from their perspective, but I'm sure they'll come to speak to this piece. And I think the key for them was timely notification. This wasn't requiring quarterly updates. It wasn't saying everything that happens. It's just timely notification. Section 25, we're now in human services, repeals the potential reuse of Chimpton Regional Correctional Facility site report. So folks have backed away from this request, which was in last year's capital bill. If it is helpful, I can pretty quickly pull up that language if you would like to see it. And in the future, I'm happy to provide as well. Section 26, we're talking about the Vermont Veterans Home. This is just ensuring there's offsetting of federal funds. So if the Commissioner of Finance and Management offsets any capital funds appropriated in the 2023 capital bill for the emergency generator, for the plant replacement, the Vermont Veterans Home, for the elevator upgrade with federal funds, then any offset amounts shall be reused for future capital construction projects. This is a way of ensuring that those funds, if offset, return to the capital bill process rather than going elsewhere. So it's keeping those funds within you guys' jurisdiction, basically. Section 27, Sergeant at Arms. This is backing up something that, as I understand it, has already happened. There was an appropriation of $100,000 last year, or in the current fiscal year, to the Sergeant at Arms for the replacement of State House cafeteria furnishings. That amount of $100,000 was greater than is necessary with cafeteria furnishing. And there's a desire to install that X-ray machine to screen baggage in particular situations. This is just creating the flexibility that you can use those funds for the X-ray machine. This was also included and may still be included in the BAA, I believe. But there is some concern with the vetoes going on that you need to ensure that this remains part of it. And additionally, it's sort of intuitive that it might be included in the capital bill as well, because this is classic cash infrastructure. This is state house expenditures. Lastly, effective date act takes effect upon passage like all other capital bills, and that is the capital bill as passed by the House. Happy to address questions, pull things up as appropriate, or sign them.
Anyone have a question other than me? I didn't know. So, yeah, go ahead.
I unmuted myself. So this is very, very helpful. Thank you. Just a couple of questions. One is regarding the appropriations. My understanding is that the legislature is actually the one who appropriates. It's the entire legislature that appropriates. I mean, we have appropriation committees, but they recommend to the legislature. It's just they're the last folks to have the budget, so they have more influence on it. But isn't it true that technically the legislature?
Yes, that's correct. That's correct.
Okay. So on section 22, and I might have already asked you this, but it says capital infrastructure sub-account singular, not both accounts, and we have those two accounts. Does that apply to both of the accounts?
No, this just applies to the ones that you guys are typically thinking about. That sub-account A or 1, the capital infrastructure, the one that is conceptually you think of as the capital bill sub-account. This just applies to that piece.
Okay, was that intentional that B not be included?
I wasn't part of the drafting of the initial cash fund, but presumably it was. And it may reflect this division amongst committees of jurisdiction, right? Because the other sub-account is maybe dealt with through the traditional budgeting process, whereas this one is kind of thought of as capital bill overflow. But I would say the same thing as before, which is this is being worked out. You guys are working this out. The current law is that this just applies to that capital infrastructure sub-account, but you could totally change this if you would like to.
Okay, I was just trying to understand the.
Yeah.
And then this might be a question for somebody else on in section 24, where it's the capital complex flood recovery.
Yes.
I just want to make sure the capital complex board or committee is getting these reports, and I believe that the special committee on the planning process for capital complex flood recovery is probably a subcommittee of the capital complex board.
Let me just pull up the act and I can screen share. So we can see exactly what that says. Okay. So the special committee on capital complex flood recovery is established. I'll zoom in a little bit.
Oh, so it actually does not include the capital complex.
Yeah, it comprises the joint fiscal committee and chairs of these committees. So
Okay. All right. Well, I'd like to find out more. I mean, maybe they're fine to not be part of that, but I would be surprised. All right. I think. Oh, and just a note for people watching, if they're concerned about the repeal of the Chittenden Regional Correctional Facility site, that had to do with the men's reentry. So I don't want folks to think that we're not still interested in a men's reentry facility. We are. It's just somewhere else. And that's all I have.
And I have a couple of questions. So the notwithstandings from this. We're allowing them to retain.
yes, the reallocations.
Is the intention there that the clock will restart? Or we'll have to review it next
You
year?
would need to notwithstand it each time.
Each
You
time.
would need to revisit each year.
Okay, that's what I had thought.
Yep.
And this is a question I would usually ask offline because I think it might be a stupid question.
I like those.
In the big bill, there's the appropriation of 7.5 million for the cash fund.
Hmm.
which is with the specific account, this is account A. Then there's another appropriation of $1 million. What is the $1 million?
So,
I can tell you the section. John, you have,
I was gonna say Scott may know better, yeah.
United Committee, for the record, Scott Morgan, Fiscal Office. So essentially, in last year's capital bill, the House had taken testimony from the state colleges about changes needing to a couple different halls, Vale and Green Hall. And the testimony was they weren't gonna need $1 million because of the fact that they weren't gonna go forward with, I can't remember if it was Green or Vale. So in essence, they said we only need 6.5 million instead of 7.5 million. The House then said appropriations, great, here's $1 million. You know, we only need to pull 6.5 instead of 7.5, got $1 million extra. Have at it, do what you with it, basically. Then throughout the course of the appropriations process, that $1 million didn't end up getting used. So it still lived in cash account B. So what that appropriation of big bill does basically is it just takes that $1 million and it moves it from B to A, so it can be used in A. So we talked about Representative Emlyn's saying we gave that money back to appropriations. Through the mechanics of giving it back was instead of us transferring $1 million out of account B back to appropriations, back to all around the circles. The mechanically easier thing to do was just to say, don't transfer in $8 million, only transfer in 7, and then we'll move this 1 million from account B to account A.
Okay,
So that's what that is about.
so then why does your spreadsheet have 7.5?
Because we look below it also has 1.2 million. 1.2 million is prior year's balance. So 7.5 is there, and a prior year balance is the one that changed from gotcha.
Okay. It wasn't entirely a stupid question. That was a little.
No, that's a good question.
Yeah,
Okay, that's what that's popped up with me in the front.
and just to speak to some of the humor that I think happened in that situation. There's a bunch of talk about like how to move money between projects to ensure that you have the right thing, but there's such a simple solution, which is just to outright reduce the amount. Yeah.
There's lots of movement of funds between 150,000 from this project and 200 from that project, then we get 139,642 from this other project. And then we said, you know what, it's just
Clean, simple. Yeah.
makes the math easier and cleaner.
Yeah, and it's so much better. Yes.
But that difference is the $7.1 million that Senator Ingles mentioned. They were going to transfer 14.8 was, they only transferred 7.5.
Right.
And that's that differential is where you're seeing that. Right.
Okay.
Like, look at that back. Those were.
High five you, gets you after.
Lot of them.
All right, do we have anything? Was this very
Like-
easy walkthrough for you?
This was great.
Good.
This is great.